Welcome to Season 2 of the Psych Sessions Network podcast Teaching Matters, co-hosted by Rob McIntarfer of Lincoln Public Schools and Eric Landrum of Boise State University. These 10 episodes in our second season were recorded from the beginning of May through the beginning of September 2021. And as you will hear, we wander and meander quite a bit. However, there are themes for us that emerge, such as the roles that AP Psychology and IB Psychology play in U.S. high schools, the continuing challenges of assessment, and how scaling innovative pedagogies makes utilizing those principles all the more difficult. To take a deeper dive into understanding the IB Psychology world, we invited Casey Swanson, a Michigan-based educator, to join us as our first guest on Teaching Matters. We broke away from our typical conversations in other ways, too. For one episode, we chatted about Albert Bandura, and Eric shared some stories from his own personal interactions. One episode in Season 2 had to be marked explicit. And if I repeated that word here in the introduction, then I would end up having to mark all of these episodes explicit. We end Season 2 stumbling on what perhaps could become a subtitle for our Teaching Matters series here. See what you think. Teaching Matters. Oh, Rob, but Eric? I am not going to give you any more context than that, my friends. You'll just have to listen. Please enjoy listening to Season 2 of Teaching Matters. Oh, Rob, but Eric.
I don't have a topic on top of mind. Do you have a topic on top of mind? There's a conversation. I don't know if this is a topic, but a recent conversation in my district that might start us off and put us in a different direction.
Okay.
Project-based learning or problem-based learning or inquiry-based learning or discovery learning. Some people have distinctions between those terms and other people would use them interchangeably, and people might get mad about those distinctions or not. But the general idea of when you're asking students...
Okay, so before you go any further, so welcome back to another episode in Season 2, mind you, of Beyond, no, not Beyond. Okay, I got to start that again. I'm sorry. Welcome back to another episode in Season 2, Teaching Matters. And I'm here with my good friend, Rob McIntarfer. I'm Eric Landrum. And Rob has just mentioned a brilliant topic for us to talk about today. Rob, would you mind recapping what you just said? I'm sorry to ask you to do it again.
In my district, I'm talking with several folks. In my position, I'm an assessment evaluation specialist, and I get to work with curriculum specialists. Curriculum specialists in my district are folks who not only choose curriculum, they also offer advice to teachers about pedagogy and assessment, things like that. I love working with curriculum specialists. Some of the educationese or edubabble or educational terms that we're using around here are coming up repeatedly in conversation. I think this is in the corner of the educational universe that people use terms like project-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, discovery learning. There are probably other terms that I'm not thinking of. When those discussions occur, there seems to be some disagreement among curriculum specialists, and I'm interested in the relationship between direct instruction, knowledge acquisition, and timing in those processes. So getting specific, if you want to get some students together, or if you want students to work on a project, when is it better to give some direct instruction or somehow get information to students about vocabulary and maybe even concepts before they start versus allowing students to dig in and get their hands dirty and discover some of that information on their own?
So, Rob, what you're talking about, and just to maybe simplify, I hope, our chat for ourselves and our audience, you're not talking about group work or teamwork. You're talking about individual students working on their own work, and you're talking about direct instruction of giving them step by step versus kind of like their own discovery and giving them an end goal and letting them just flounder versus step one, step two, step three, a cookbook recipe. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah. And it's where's the sweet spot? And what are the contextual factors that as teachers we should be thinking about where that sweet spot is? And by the way, I think this conversation might apply to individual work or group work. I'm not sure that variable is necessarily what I'm focusing on, but maybe I should. But I think everybody agrees that whether you're having an individual or a group tackle something, they need to know some information beforehand, but they don't necessarily need to know everything, because the reason you're having them do something is so that they can have the experience of applying and not just following a recipe.
And I asked that because the group work, teamwork scenario is just much more complicated. There are many more factors.
Yeah.
As usual, you bring up something really interesting to talk about. And when the task is, if I use the technical term, delimited, that is, the parameters are really known well and the outcome is highly defined, I think it's easier for the instructor to point their students towards that outcome. And in some aspects, it's easier for students to make their way. I mean, it's almost like knowing the address in a GPS.
Mhm.
If you can give the GPS coordinates the exact address, it's a lot easier to get turn by turn instructions than saying it's 400 miles to the north. That doesn't really tell you where you want to go. However, when our students leave either high school or college and they get into the real world of employment, employers often say, go figure out for me this problem that has a fuzzy solution or no solution. So I often have thought about, I can teach a student in research methods how to write the APA format paper that has an introduction, method, results, and discussion. And unless they're going to graduate school, the vast majority are not going to do that. They're not going to follow that nice, neat cookie cutter template, which I adore, quite honestly. So I may not be giving them the skill set to be able to adapt to a GPS coordinate that is unclear.
I agree. And I think this gets us to a topic that we've talked about before, which is transfer. And
Yes.
probably far transfer is really what we're after, I think,
Yeah.
as opposed to near transfer. If that's the gold standard or the holy grail or whatever we want to call it, I think every teacher would love to think that they are helping students acquire knowledge and skills that they can acquire, that they can use in a novel situation.
But I don't want to detract from what your conversation was about, though. I don't want to get
Well,
us
I think
off.
this is related to this conversation. I think many times the reasons teachers do project-based learning, problem-based learning, blah, 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 is because they think that's a good way to teach for transfer. And they may be right. It may be a great way, releasing some autonomy to students to figure something out on their own might be one of our best tools to teach for far transfer. You think?
I do. And it's one of these things where I try to at times practice what I preach. So I teach a capstone class. And so it's for seniors on the cusp of graduating their last semester, their second to last semester. And one of the assignments in that class is an infographic. So they have to pick a topic that's meaningful to them in somewhere in the history of psychology. And they have to find a certain number of research articles, empirical research, but they have to create an infographic in certain parameters uh, with a certain number of citations, but they have to prepare it for the lay public. So I want them to have this SciComm skill set, at least practice it or dabble in it. They've written APA papers all of their undergraduate career, but can they pick a topic that they're passionate about and essentially present a poster that communicates to the public this complex issue in their own words, but using citations to back it up factually with psychological science? And that's a skill that is marketable because I can point them to industries and employers that will hire on that. And that's the kind of thing where there are some parameters for the assignment, but there are some skills that they really haven't practiced a lot that they struggle with. But I want them to struggle with it because they got to get used to that struggle before they go off and get a job.
I think that's a fantastic example. And the word struggle is super productive here, super useful here, because what we want is productive struggle.
Right.
But there's another type of struggle I expect, and I've seen students experience this too, where a teacher's given a really open-ended project, open-ended assignment, and the student doesn't have the knowledge or the skills that they need yet to struggle productively with that. So they spin their wheels and come up with something wildly off that they might be very proud of, which then you have to backtrack on. So I think maybe another way to ask my question, I think it's always a teacher decision about what knowledge and practice do I need to give to students so that they can have productive struggle with the project that I've given them.
Yeah, I think I think you've led me down to a path that I think is insightful. So thank you. My same assignment I just described, the infographic, in an intro psych would not be nearly as effective because I don't think let me put it this way. I don't think my intro psych students would not be savvy enough. First off, they don't understand psychological terms at a deeper level yet. They certainly can't read 6 or 8 or 10 articles about a concept such as cognitive dissonance or a negative reinforcement, and then be able to translate it into a poster to communicate it to the public if they're in their first course ever. So giving that assignment with those parameters to intro psych students wouldn't make any sense, and it would cause them to struggle. That would be unproductive or non-productive struggling.
Yeah, and we're probably close to Vygotskian zone of proximal development here, I bet. But I think it's a little bit more specific because it's not just I'm trying to acquire new knowledge and skills. Is this in my zone of proximal development? Can I acquire this new knowledge and skills? I think it's a special situation. Can I productively struggle independently and learn something from that struggle? And what do I need before I'm released by my teacher to go off on my own and try this?
Yeah, and I think, and I know we keep coming back to themes that we've chatted about before, but I think at least in this little example of an infographic, this is the classic version of if you want to know if someone understands something, have them attempt to teach it to someone else. And so if a student has to put together an infographic in their own words, even by relying on citations, you figure out, and they do too, if they really understand it. And then in one year before COVID, before pandemic, for the final exam and capstone, the students had a poster session, a literal poster session where we printed all the infographics in a small ballroom, had them displayed, and then I invited our departmental faculty to come by for a very informal final exam where there are 50 capstone students and 3 or 4 faculty were able to come, and they just mingled and walked around and chatted informally with students. And when you're talking to a faculty member about your infographic, that's where the metal meets the road, right? That's where the rubber meets the road. And so pedal to the metal, I'll get it there. I'll get it there eventually. So teaching it to someone else, putting something into your own words, independent of citing it out of a book, is a really good way to check and see if someone knows their stuff.
Yeah. And I think when we're saying knows their stuff, it's a different level of knowing your stuff. It's the way we might assess knowing your stuff, some students might be able to answer even a good open-ended essay question and they can demonstrate they know their stuff. But if the task is actually a FAR transfer task, they may struggle with that. They may fail with, not productively struggle with that. They may fail at that task because you need a deeper level of understanding in order to be able to transfer knowledge and skills to a new context, maybe.
Yeah, you need deeper level and you need repeated practice.
Yep.
I really do think it's a use it or lose it.
Yep.
So if you're not engaging in that material or in that concept on a fairly regular basis, you lose it. And as either young adults or older adults like we are, there's stuff I learned a long time ago that if I haven't revisited it, I lose it. Or there are software programs that I use once a year or twice a year that every single time I got to do it again, I've got to go to the help version, or I've got to call a buddy, or I've got to email our help desk. And it's like, I don't use it enough to get proficient. So I'm a novice all over again once a year. It's like Groundhog Day. I'm in the same loop over and over again because I just never get proficient.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that in my job. I have some yearly tasks that I have to document the hell out of because I know the next time I come to them, it's like I'm a novice again. I had I think a similar experience to your experience with your capstone poster presentation. In my AP psychology class, I had students do year-long research projects, and it was one of my favorite things about the class. That's not required by AP psychology. It might not even be wise, but I tried it, and it usually was effective. And I had students present at the end of the year. I remember one young woman who I think produced really good evidence that her struggle was non-productive. Unfortunately, I didn't know that she was engaging in non-productive struggle in this project until way too late. It was when she was presenting in front of class. I did not know we'd done a research methods and a statistics unit, and she'd done just fine on the test. But when faced with her own data, she engaged in a lot of struggle. She worked really hard on her own data, and she produced these really fairly complicated three-dimensional diagrams. She did some things with Microsoft Excel that I don't know how to do, and I'm not sure why they're possible. They were really complicated three-dimensional graphs.
Okay.
She had more axes on there than I knew what to do with.
Sure.
As other students questioned her about that, because they're supposed to, because you're supposed to have a Q&A at the end, it became immediately apparent to her and everybody else in the room that she did not know what her own graphs meant,
Yeah.
which was really sad and embarrassing for her and not productive for anybody. And I needed a way as a teacher to know what else she needed before engaging in that struggle. So that's the research area that I'd like to hear more about. How, as teachers, do we figure out before students are released on their own to productively struggle with creating something in a new context? How should I check to make sure they have what they need?
Well, Rob, y- wow. That's a very noble thing that you're asking to do, but you're almost asking for a complete inventory of a student's knowledge and skill set before you allow them to present it
Yeah.
publicly. And
Yeah. That's not practical. So what do we do?
it's not practical. And even, and what I could even see is that there's a dynamic going on. Maybe it wouldn't have happened in your class, but I could see that student sitting with you and explaining it perfectly. I mean, I'm being honest, being perfectly, but getting up in front of a student class and in certain scenarios, certain social situations, it may not be it may not be in that student's interest to look smart in front of their colleagues. And I know that's weird to say, but there are certain social situations where sometimes students don't want to appear to be geeky or nerdy. And so there's all kinds of things going on. Now, I think in your situation that you just described, the student discovered a bells and whistles feature and just ran every graphic interface that she could. But then, like you said, one question, she really didn't know what she was doing. And that just came to light. But unless you had quizzed her privately before she got in front of your class, and you did that for I don't know how many 20, 25, 30 students, and you had that kind of time for every assignment before it was presented, how would you have known that?
Yeah, and they turned in drafts of their results section, and she ended up presenting. A lot of it was on her. She ended up presenting in her slides visualizations that were different than what she turned in a rough draft. So I didn't quite know what was happening.
Right, and I would gently argue or at least make the case that although embarrassing, and we don't ever design classroom experiences to be purposely embarrassing, that was hopefully a real important learning experience for her. And vicariously, a really important learning experience for every other student in the class
Yep,
as to
I agree.
what not to do in the future. And it's hard to know the emotional impact of those types of events. So I don't want to minimize it. But in the grand scheme of negative emotional things that can happen to high school students, I would hope that's on the lesser end rather than the greater end.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
The more general issue, and I bet this will come up again in one of our future conversations. We've all experienced as teachers and students a project that isn't a project because it's outlined too carefully. A science lab that is much more like baking a cake
Yep.
precisely according to a recipe than it is any actual thinking. We've also all experienced a project that's way too open-ended, and we don't have the information we need to actually struggle productively with it. So I think I'm really asking for research and discussion about, as teachers, how we figure out the sweet spot. I think a lot of teachers have. I'm not sure how explicitly we write and talk about that yet. I think we've got some lessons that we've learned, but I'm not sure how much discussion or scholarship there is on that.
Yeah. So you're interested in how do you figure out a way to get students to hit the fairway every time?
Yeah.
Not to be in the rough in one place, not to be in the sand trap or the water
Yeah.
hazard. And
And not have someone behind them effectively swinging the club. Because if I write a lab, but I write down explicitly what students are supposed to do at every single step, that's not really a lab.
well, and here's what came to my mind. Not that that's really an answer, but maybe a jumping off point. I think we have to do the maybe not backward course design, but the backward assignment design. I think the answer to what you've just brought up depends on what's your goal. So if your goal is to expose students to classic psychological phenomena, the phi phenomena, the Zeigarnik effect, the Stroop effect. I mean, if you want students to come away understanding the Mueller-Lyer illusion, if you want them to understand those things, then those pre-canned experiments using a MyPsychLab or Revel or whatever software program, insert name here, then those are really quite good at doing those things. I mean, so the recipe works, and I would say minimize your effort as an instructor. Um, if you want them to learn the scientific method and how to write about a method section and materials, procedure, participants, and if you don't care if they can replicate the Stroop effect, if you don't care that they can get to the results section, but you just want them to get their hands dirty in the methods of psychology, then that open-ended approach would be fine, I think.
That's a really good point. So it depends on your objective. And that takes us back to FAR transfer. If my objective is FAR transfer, I've got to set up something different than if my objective is just that students learn the Mueller-Lyer.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of a example from high school psych, but I don't know if this was true in college psych or not. In intro psych or in college psych classrooms, was there a facial feedback activity that involved holding a pen or a pencil in your mouth and looking at cartoons and rating their level of funniness? Does that ring a bell?
Not to me, but that doesn't mean that others might have done that.
It was pretty popular in high school psychology classrooms for a while. And sometimes it was labeled a lab because you used it to gather data. So the basic protocol was there was one set of cartoons that you projected on the screen. You randomly assign people to conditions. One condition was hold a pen or a pencil in your mouth, and I'll demonstrate for Eric, but now the rest of you can see it. You hold it in your mouth horizontally.
Okay.
So it forces the corners of your mouth up, and you one group looks at the cartoons with that in their mouth, and one group looks at the cartoons without that in their mouth. The idea was, according to the facial feedback hypothesis, if your mouth is corners turned up, you're aware of that in your brain, which provides feedback, which will cause you to think things are funnier than if you just have nothing in your mouth. So for years, high school teachers did this and gathered data in the class, and often the data didn't produce the desired effect. There was either no difference between the groups or it was just noisy and random. I know a lot of teachers, and I did this once, and I didn't know why the data didn't turn out right, but I still dutifully taught what was in the textbook, which was the facial feedback hypothesis. Even though our data didn't confirm the hypothesis or didn't support the hypothesis, that's probably due to our sample size, blah, 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 blah. And then flash forward to years later with the replication crisis, and it turns out, I think the facial feedback hypothesis is one that's not terribly supported upon replication.
Yeah, I think there's a confound with putting a pencil in your mouth.
Yep.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, and I got to say this carefully. Are you familiar with RBF?
No.
Um, RBF is resting face.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm using this as gender neutral. Males or females can have RBF.
You bet.
And I wonder if a high school or college instructor could surreptitiously identify their students as RBF or non-RBF, again, males or females, and then ask them about the facial feedback hypothesis.
Yes. Yeah.
So the instructor assigns, but you may be right. It could be that it may not have been replicable, but I think to me, the issue would be the pencil in the mouth. But but that kind of thing though, Rob, makes me think, present that to your class, show them that it doesn't work, and then have them brainstorm about there's this thing in your textbook, there's this thing in your lab manual. It didn't work. Why do you think it didn't work? One summer I was asked, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago, to help run a summer research institute. And they were having a weekend where they brought actually high school students, high school juniors or seniors to campus. And they asked me, would you do a demo of some sort of research method? So I actually did the classic Coke versus Pepsi challenge.
Cool.
So I went and got red and blue cups and Coke Pepsi and did the setup where I could do it blind and double blind. And our students, whether they're high school students or college students, are natural experimenters.
Yep.
If you forget about making them give you the experimental and control and randomized, if you forget about making them give you the nomenclature, the labels, they're experimenters. And you throw out, well, Coke is preferred because more people with that. Well, no, you forgot to do this. Okay, well, let's set it up that way. And then we test it again. They get it. People understand when you make a claim and the claim may not be correct, they get it.
I agree. And a pedagogical question, is there that would they have gotten it at an even deeper or more transferable level if they would have learned some of those vocabulary terms beforehand and then gotten to apply them? Or is there added value to not giving that explicit instruction early on, not telling them about IVDV, just letting them go at it, and then later on helping them label what they did? Does that matter? Does order matter?
So I don't have an empirical answer for that. My gut answer, and I have a very big gut. My gut answer is that order does matter, and let them play in the sandbox first. And then come in from the sandbox, towel off, wash off, and then say, okay, remember when we flipped a coin to decide what soda went into what color cup? That was called randomization. Let them be natural. Let them be 5-year-old experimenters on the playground first and let them figure it out. The fun of that was me making false claims and saying, okay, the experiment is over. We now know from one person tasting it, that Pepsi's the winner. And they go, no, that's not enough people. Oh, okay, we'll have 2. No, that's not enough. And or pouring the Coke in front of them. You can't do that. Why not? Because they can see it. Oh, you mean I got to hide? So they can solve it and then tell them after. And for me, at least, then label the things or the variables or the procedures after the fact.
I think that's a super cool topic because I can argue either way.
Yes, I could too.
I totally believe you, but I think it might be something that is empirically testable, at least in some controlled contexts. And maybe we could figure out some generalizable guidelines that we can use as teachers about, given a certain goal, given other contextual factors, you better upfront some terminology or you better not upfront some terminology?
I think it was Ruth Ault years and years ago as a project available in OTRP, which has been renamed now in the Society for Teaching of Psychology Resources. I think it was Ruth. She had a sample journal article and she stripped out the headings and subheadings and had it available in such a way that an instructor could download it and print out these paragraphs, and the student would actually cut out the paragraphs, but they were in randomized order.
Oh, wow.
And so a student without any headings, subheadings, or, italics or any clues, could you read and put things in the order, which is not
Wow.
exactly the same thing as what you're talking about, but there's context to what we do. We do things in a certain order. And so your comment made me think of Ruth's work.
Shout out to Ruth Ault. That's super creative. And at the AP Psych reading, Ruth was one of my favorite table leaders to work with, always. So thorough, so creative. That is a fascinating assignment, isn't it? That's a support on the way to really even reading maybe effectively a peer-reviewed journal article.
Right, because you gotta really understand in psychology, the method section comes before the results section, and what do
Yeah.
method sections look like and sound like? And
Yeah.
there are parts of a discussion section that sound a little bit like the parts of an intro, an introduction. Sometimes they might not be so discernible, and you gotta be able to figure out, okay, that's gotta be an abstract, so I know that goes up front. So, I mean, it was really a pretty savvy thing to ask. And again, something that a junior or senior psychology major should be better able to do than a freshman or sophomore. And that's one of the benefits of assessment would be if you were doing that on a regular basis in your department, you would have a nice little indicator of what you're doing in your program.
No kidding. Anybody who's thinking about assessment in your undergraduate program, you could set up that up pretty precisely as a pre-post. If you can control the difficulty level of the article, which I don't think it'd be too hard, similar length, similar statistical analysis, if a person can do that, I think you can reasonably infer that they have a certain level of understanding about psychology as a science, or at least communicating psychology as a science, and a person who doesn't. And then another possible purpose of that, if you've written an article or if you're trying to judge the quality of an article, I think that's an assessment, potentially an assessment for the quality of an article. A poorly written article, that might be an impossible task.
Right, because in a well-written anything, the lead sentence of every paragraph should signal really the value or the key idea of the entire paragraph.
Yeah.
I mean, you could use it as a pre-post even to research methods, quite honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you've done a lot more review of journal articles than I have. I've just done a little bit of it, but I'm thinking I might use that idea now. The next journal article I review, just look at a paragraph in isolation. If I don't immediately know where that paragraph belongs in the article, it needs revision.
Yeah, and I know we tend to wander, which is actually part of the fun, and who knows if the audience follows us or not, but oftentimes people writing journal articles are not writing for a general psychological audience, but they're writing for a promotion and tenure committee, or they're writing for a department chair or an NSF grant panel. And so there's all kinds of things that mess up the process of writing for journal articles.
Absolutely. Most of my recent experience, I was helping with an EDD program and being on the committee of people who are writing EDD dissertations. And often, I think this gives me a new way to express to them potential revisions, because sometimes you're writing about a similar topic in your intro chapter 1 and your lit review chapter 2. But I should know, it has to do with purpose of the chapter. I should know by that paragraph why you are writing about that study at this point in time. And in some ways, this is a wonder, but in some ways, this is not. When we're talking about writing, we're talking about a far transfer task, I think. And we're talking about people being able to do a task on their own without a lot of supports. So I think Ruth's assignment might be one of the necessary supports before a person is released to go out and write something on their own.
And writing is, the skill that I'll speak for college professors, which I probably shouldn't. Writing is a skill that college professors may be the most comfortable in assessing beyond a multiple choice test format or beyond a typical test format, whether it be a true false or a multiple choice, multiple guess, multiple gift type of format. And so when I proselytize about skills, there's a whole host of skills in different domains. And the one that people can buy into is writing. They see the value. They know how to grade writing, which is not the same as assessing writing, but they know how to, they can picture how to assess writing. They have a more difficult time thinking about assessing critical thinking. They see a lot more difficulty and work into assessing something like, let's say, oral communication or ethical reasoning and problem solving. They'll say, yeah, we really value that. But how do you assess it in your graduates before they get their degree? Well, that's a way more difficult conversation for everybody, including me.
Yeah. And we of all people in psychology, of all people, we should be able to admit that some variables are really tricky to operationally define, which is what we're talking about here. I think you're right. I think the teachers that I know are more comfortable operationally defining what quality is based on a certain writing assignment rather than operationally defining what critical thinking means in a specific context.
Oh, absolutely. And we have colleagues around the country, and I think we've mentioned this before, who have tackled critical thinking and done it really well. Diane Halpern, who I know we've mentioned in a previous episode. There are critical thinking inventories that are out there that are multiple choice. Those are available. There are critical thinking tasks that are project oriented or project based, that you have a task and you have to solve this problem by using X components and Y amount of time. And there are actually even creativity pieces that are built into those where they've got it almost standardized in certain ways. But those aren't used typically widely. And some of them are commercial products, and that scares away some departments of psychology around the US.
Yeah. And speaking of writing, even I agree that I think most teachers are most comfortable with their own operational definitions of what quality writing is in their context. I wonder I wonder sometimes about the transfer between high school and college writing, in that in many K-12 systems, we've gotten pretty prescriptive about what quality writing is in an effort to try to make sure that every student can write effectively before graduating. Sometimes what we fall back on is a very supportive writing instruction environment where and there are a lot of pluses for this. There might be a standard rubric for a persuasive essay, and students get multiple opportunities to write persuasive essays and get feedback about it based on this one standardized rubric. And there's a lot to be said for that. But what if that's the only way that a student can write something persuasive? And so every single thing a student writes ends up sounding very similar.
Right. And what if that persuasive essay was the thing that helped them get into the college of their choice?
There you go.
Then they've got a system that they think works for them. And actually it gets them through the generic English 101 and 102, and they're getting A's in that. And then all of a sudden they get to the buzzsaw of psychology or sociology or mechanical engineering or something else. And it's a different format, a different way of thinking about writing. And all of a sudden, this A student, this A writer, so to speak, is now struggling like they never have before.
And probably a far transfer fail, which is what we've been talking about. And so what that might mean is the supports that we're providing for students to write we needed to remove some of that in order for students to be able to practice far transferring what they know about writing to a new context.
Or they need, sometimes we need to build in the practice of struggling,
Yeah.
the practice of, I don't know exactly what's expected, and build in the practice of confidence. I
Yeah.
don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but I'm pretty sure I'll be okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna take a stab at this. I think a lot of times, and this may not be the proper word, a lot of times students and quite honestly, faculty in some cases, they just want or think they need a lot of hand-holding,
Yeah.
and I don't think hand-holding is the same thing as scaffolding.
I think you're right.
Because I think on a scaffold, you could fall a little bit, but not get fatally injured.
Yeah, or you can wander on the boy, we're gonna torture this metaphor,
Yes,
but
yes, we are.
you can wander around on a platform of a scaffold. You have some agency, you have some autonomy within the platform of a scaffold. If I'm holding your hand, you're not moving.
Yeah, there's you can't get away from me, and the amount of independence you have when we're holding hands is not much at all. And
Right.
so, uh, you can't make many mistakes when we're hand holding, but you probably can't do a lot of original learning
Yeah.
and you is it unique learning or autonomous learning or discovery learning?
Yeah. Right.
Um
Now we're back to terminology.
you something that you discovered on your own and you're like, "Oh my god, I can write a haiku," as opposed to, "Okay, Dr. McIntyre first said 575. Okay, then he wrote one, then he wrote the first 2 lines for one, and I wrote the 3rd line. Then he gave me one where he wrote the first line, I wrote the next 2, and then okay, then he gave me There Once Was a Man from Nantucket." No, I can't do that one. And so yeah, we were torturing this analogy, but I think there's something in there.
I think there is too, and I'm gonna send you a follow-up email and we'll decide together if this is worth another episode. The learning scientists, I found a citation on a learning scientist blog that I think might hone in on a useful aspect of this. It was about the order effect. They thought what they said they were testing the difference between what they called guided discovery and discovery learning. And it, I think, had to do with a level of hand holding or scaffolding or release of student autonomy. So I'll send that to you and we can decide if we want to talk
Well,
about it.
and I was thinking, Rob, and we should probably sign off here pretty soon, but I was thinking also as we were discussing this topic, at some point we should start inviting maybe some guests on. We have some connections with some great colleagues around the country. In terms of writing, the people that came to my mind would be Dana Dunn, Jane Hallen, and Randy Smith would be the 3 people that popped in my head. And there are certainly more. Um, it might be fun to invite 1, 2, or all 3 of them to come on and either individually or as a panel, just chat with them about some of these things that we've raised here today.
I think that'd be great. It's a nice follow up. Jane and Garth have been having had that whole great series about productive scholarship, and a lot of that was about writing as a scholar. This is a similar take, but a little different. So you're a teacher and you want to figure out how to help students engage in productive struggle and learning how to write like a psychologist.
Right, and Randy has just had a relatively new book come out with, um, is it Sage or I think I'm sorry, believe it's Worth, and Dana has written extensively about writing advice. And so Randy, with 12 years of experience editing, teaching of psychology for STP, and like you said, Jane just had a mini series that launched with Garth called Writing for Psychology on the Psych Sessions Network. All right, Rob, thank you, buddy.
Thank you. This was fantastic as usual. Thanks. I'm glad we solved all the problems.
Until next time.
Okay. Bye, man.